Now, the second video of my back-to-back sports video. This one's going to be picking up where I left off. This is episode 4. And this is going to be my man, George Foreman, in his prime, and out of his prime, versus Wiadimir Klitschko. I know some of you boxing fans are spitting out your Coca-Cola, your Pepsi, your Sprite, your 7-Up, your Mountain Dew, your Cimarron Mist, your coffee, your tea, your water. You heard what I said. George Foreman, in his prime and out of his prime, versus Wiadimir Klitschko, a.k.a. Dr. Steelhammer. This is boxing what if. What if we took two fighters that are heavyweights from two different time periods and have them fight each other in their primes? This is a new boxing series. I came up with this idea because someone told me, you talk about basketball and football too much. Talk about other sports if you're going to make a sports channel. So I've been challenged last year, and I told them I would eventually get around to it. And by the time I get my day off this week, Wednesday and Thursday, that's when I'm going to start talking about some hockey. That's when I'm going to talk about the sports I like. I'll put them on both channels to see who likes the videos or not. All right, George Foreman got his start in boxing. Let's see, he was born in Texas, Houston, Texas, or some part of it. Strange and ironic. It seems like people like George Foreman, The Undertaker, Jason David Frank. It seems like all the famous people that you would expect are from Texas. He started doing street fighting at the age of 15 or 16 years old. He got into street fights. Now, people like me and you, we were playing with our Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, our Power Rangers, action figures. He was out there getting the street fights because he didn't have no job. And his parents and grandparents had to always bail him out of trouble. So one day, to teach him a lesson for disciplinary action, they waited until he got 16 or 17, and they sent him off to boot camp. And then he made his way to Los Angeles. You know how I know? Because there's some history with this person. Luther Martin King Jr.'s daughter or granddaughter, some 30 years later, would come to my high school, Westchester High School, in her late 50s, and she told the story of George Foreman. We actually sat in an auditorium for about an hour and a half, because she came to our high school, because she was visiting all the high schools in California to decide which high school should represent Luther Martin King Jr. in some speech competition that they had at the time. And she was telling us the story of George Foreman. And George Foreman got sent to foster home too, just so you know. He had real parents, but he kept getting into street fights. In Texas, Houston, Texas, they call it the Bloody Fifth Ward because people get hurt in Houston, Texas. Ask the Undertaker. Yeah, same place where the Undertaker was at back in the day. And it's like 1963, 1964, they saw that he could knock people out with his punching power and said, let's just get this guy into amateurs boxing. He was killing people in amateur boxing. He was knocking them out. It didn't matter. Right hand, left hand, you got knocked out by George Foreman, fight was over. He was Mike Tyson before there was Mike Tyson. Literally, he was Mike Tyson before we had Mike Tyson. He was like a resurrection of Jack Johnson mixed in with Sonny Liston. And finally, when we got to 1968, he won an Olympic gold medal. And then his professional boxing career started. He would constantly knock people out. All of a sudden, he was 10-0. Then he was 15-0, 20-0. And then all of a sudden, he won I apologize, my next door neighbor is doing, he's cutting some wood, and you're going to hear the chainsaw in the background. It sucks when you do YouTube videos and you get all these strange occurrences, but bear with me, please. The videos coming up this week, you won't be hearing those types of sounds, so I apologize for the noise audio. Now, George Foreman basically was just knocking people out. Then he finally fought the fighter in 1971. He became the #1 heavyweight contender for the championship, but it wasn't until 1972 that he got his shot at the title. George Foreman would fight Joe Frazier because Frazier beat Muhammad Ali in the thing called the Fight of the Century and proved that he was the heavyweight champion. And then George Foreman did to Joe Frazier what Muhammad Ali could not do in that first fight. He knocked him out. He knocked Joe Frazier down like 4 times in the fight. Fight didn't even make it to 15 rounds. He knocked him out like in the 6th or the 7th round. Fight was over, and he became the heavyweight champion of the world. And this is with an undefeated record. And then he would just dominate from there. In 1972, 1973, yeah, he would dominate just knocking people out. Like, couldn't nobody take the title from George Foreman. At that point, his record was like 30-0, 33-0, 34-0, until he met Muhammad Ali. And this was like 1974. So for about 2 years, George Foreman held on to the heavyweight championship belt because couldn't nobody take it from him. George was like a big guy. George was like 6'5", 6'6", 260, 265. That was, at that time, that was uncommon for a heavyweight to be that big. And Ali used the rope-a-dope and took the belt from George Foreman. But before he could fight George, he fought Joe Frazier in a rematch and beat Joe Frazier. Joe Frazier tried to get a rematch with George Foreman and lost twice. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? And then he loses to Muhammad Ali and Africa Zaire and lose the championship and has his undefeated record broken. And then he retires in 1977 because he lost to a fighter named Jimmy Young. And then he is retired. You know, he gets remarried. He ends up with six kids, gets married 3 times, starts preaching the word of God, becomes a church pastor, and then he goes bankrupt. And then he comes out of retirement in the late 80s, early 90s, and makes a boxing comeback. And even for a guy past his physical prime, he still had that power that still could knock you out. And he was knocking people half his age out, which was a shock to a lot of people. And then we get to 1994, where he gets his second shot at being heavyweight champion of the world and knocks out poor Michael Moore at 27 years old and takes the WBO Heavyweight Championship. Yeah, he fought Evander Holyfield. He lost to Evander. He almost knocked Evander Holyfield out in that fight, by the way. Like, he literally was ticks away. Had that been scheduled for 15 rounds instead of 12, he would have knocked out Evander Holyfield. So Evander was lucky to survive that as champion. So that was his second title shot. He then fights Michael Moore, takes it from Michael Moore, then he beats 3 other people with the championship, and then he fights Tommy the Duke Morrison, who takes the belt from him in controversial fashion. And then George Foreman continues to fight until 1997 at 48 years old. Yeah, knocks somebody out in his final fight. Yeah, George Foreman's no joke. Even past his prime, he still was knocking people out half his age. And the way he would just beat people was sad. Like, he went from just knocking you out to becoming a scientific fighter. Now, in that same time frame, somewhere in Great Britain or in Europe, there was a fighter, they say either Russian, German, or Polish, by the name of Wiadimir Klitschko. He's like 6'4", 250 pounds, with a long left hook, with a wide wingspan. And he started fighting at the age of 13, 14 years old in the Olympic trials. And the Klitschkos got discovered by, who else? Don King. Strange and ironic, isn't it? Because George Foreman was once with Don King, and then you look at the Klitschkos, they're with Don King. And he brought them to the United States to box. And in 1996, we saw him in the Olympic trials, and he knocked out people and won 2 gold medals. And then Wiadimir debuted in 96 as a heavyweight and knocked somebody out in his first heavyweight debut. And then he went undefeated for 4 years. You know, he was 10-0, 20-0, 25-0. And then I think by 97 or 98, he won a vacated heavyweight championship belt, and Wiadimir Klitschko became heavyweight champion of the world by 99-2000. Suffered his first loss, got knocked out, then had a championship rematch, took the belt back, became a two-time heavyweight champion. Then won another belt to unite all three belts, and then became the reigning undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. And then this guy held on to the belt for like 13 years straight, beating people. Because he got his first loss, and then before he could get a championship rematch, he had a second loss, and then he didn't get no more losses after that. And then he was just knocking people out. No matter who they put in front of him, he knocked out. He knocked out poor Sam Peterson, because he fought him twice, knocked him out twice. He was supposed to fight Lennox Lewis before Lennox Lewis retired, but Lennox beat his big brother and then retired before he could get a shot. Yeah, so you can imagine what would have happened if he fought both Klitschkos. And he kept dominating the heavyweight division. Like, for 13 years, he just kept knocking people out. It didn't matter who you put in front of him. And he would keep doing this. And then they thought about it. You know, Mike Tyson was, on the downside of his career. It could have been Roy Jones Jr., but Roy had dropped 25 pounds of muscle and went back to the light heavyweight division to go have his epic trilogy with Antonio Tarver. And Lennox had retired, and Roy decided to go back down in weight, and we didn't have no heavyweights but them, so he was dominant for 13 years. And then finally, he would run into a guy by the name of Tyson Fury who would take those championships belts and give him a third loss. He had a championship rematch, then he ended up with 4 losses. And then he tried one last final time to get the championship belt back, and then he ended up with 5 losses. So in 17 years, he had a professional record of 69 fights, but he had a record of 64 wins and 5 losses. That's 17 years he was in boxing. But 13 out of those 17 years, Wiadimir Klitschko dominated the heavyweight division before someone could come in and take the title from him. So, in their primes, who would have won? Because George Foreman had a record of 81 fights, but a record of 76 wins and 5 losses. Now, in George Foreman's prime, he would have destroyed Wiadimir Klitschko. Like, he would have knocked Klitschko out 30 times in the fight. And the fight wouldn't even get past 12 rounds. Not even if you made it 15 rounds, you wouldn't even get to 15. Now, Wiadimir Klitschko in his prime would have lost. Now, if you take it from the point of view George past his prime, Wiadimir Klitschko wins the fight simply because by 96, that's when he came into boxing. And had George Foreman fought Wiadimir Klitschko, you would have found out that even if this George Foreman is past his physical prime, he would probably still knock him out. A prime example is when he fought Michael Moore for the WBO Heavyweight Champion. Michael Moore beat Evander Holyfield, and then Evander got hurt and ended up having a trilogy with Riddick Bowe. Because he took the belt from Riddick Bowe, lost to Michael Moore, and then George Foreman got the belt. Or in this case, he knocked out Michael Moore. Michael Moore thought he could beat George Foreman straight up, and they told him you can't. And this shows, even if George Foreman's past his physical prime, he still can knock you out with knockout power. And the same thing happened with Wiadimir Klitschko. When he tried to fight somebody like Tyson Fury, when he was past his physical prime, Tyson Fury was able to knock out Wiadimir Klitschko past his physical prime. So one fighter would destroy this person in their prime, and then past their prime, Foreman would still destroy Wiadimir Klitschko. Both guys have won the championship belt twice. Both guys have been fighting for almost 20 years. So whether it's George Foreman in his prime or past his prime, the winner is George Foreman. I know some people are going to be angry